I guess we could get started then. So hi everyone, welcome to this event, which is our let's pull it up. Our senior engineering roundtable, where we're going to talk with a few senior and staff engineers. This is one of our three kind of official AMAs with Discord. We are So this is our third one. We're gonna have more, but this is our third one that we kind of teamed up with Discord with. Uh, we will also be having future events. We're going to be having one with kind of senior VPs and senior people in the company in general. We're also going to be starting office hours up here soon, probably towards the end of the month or early August. And just a reminder, we'll remind later, but we're going to request feedback from everyone along the way. And we're going to push out a moderator and contributor form for everyone to sign up for if they want to. So kind of to introduce our guest today, we have vcarl, who is Carl. He's a moderator here in CSCH and React Flux. Got his first job in 2012. He's worked for 8 different companies, ranging from a local print shop to a Fortune 50 company. He's worked for companies doing transit, agricultural, technology, cool, advertising, finance, healthcare, and crypto, and exclusively doing front end web development with React. Then we have Inder, who has been an engineer for 10 years in a variety of roles. Starting out as a mechanical engineer who liked writing code and ending up in tech. He currently works as a staff engineer, SDT, in a medium-sized company, leading technical direction in the QA organization of about 35 people and driving cross engineering projects. Previous to his current role, he was at AWS as a systems development engineer, building tools for CI/CD automation, in addition to being a moderator on CSCH. He also was a moderator on Stack Exchanges, the workplace, and loves mentoring and helping people. We have Sky, who is a staff software engineer who has worked in the e-commerce and payment space for her career for 7 years and is an expert in enterprise scale systems and architecture. She has been a bit of a rarity in the Bay as someone who stayed at one company for almost 7 years, only just now recently switching to a different company to lead a team on payments, tooling, and infrastructure. She's interviewed hundreds of big end candidates and mentored multiple juniors on the way to mid-level and beyond, and enjoys the process of both leading and growing future engineers with their career whenever possible. So yeah, those are our 3 guests. Did I miss anything? Anyone want to add on to that?
Sounds good.
Cool. So the AMA part, we've done this 3 or 4 times now. So if anyone wants to discuss the AMA itself, there's event chat where you could go and you could talk. We will be pulling questions out of event questions. So post any questions you have there, and thumbs up and thumbs down any questions you want to hear be heard. We'll also bring people on who raise their hand. So if you want to ask a question live, just raise your hand in the stage chat. We will have people who are moderating who will bring you in or kick you out if you don't follow our rules. And yeah, so that's where we are with the AMA. So we could get started. I'm hosting today, so if someone wants, one of the mods wanted to ping me when we have a raised hand of someone who wants to talk. Cool. To start out, in the first 30 to 90 days of joining an organization, what are your planned strategies for learning and delivering impact as soon as you can? And we can start with Ender.
Yes, this is an interesting question because in my current company, my first 3 days were about 6 hours of Zoom calls doing strategic planning. That is not normal, I don't think, though. And I think really you just have to learn. Every company has different dynamics, and I think one of the other questions related to kind of the differences. But once you're starting to make decisions that are cross team, you have to really understand like the stack, understand the dynamics, understand the team, the people, and stuff like that. And really, you just have to learn with that. So you also just started a new job. I'm curious, kind of what you're going through there.
Yeah, so in my case, I just started a new job about a month ago. So this is my first 30 to 90 days of joining an organization. And I guess it's not about plan strategies, but more of just what my experience has been. I've similar to Ender, met with a lot of different leaders across the organization. Right, the team I'm on is something like 10 people, but then the actual org that I work with on a day-to-day basis is hundreds of people. And so there's been a lot of meetings with all the other leaders, so other staff engineers, maybe senior staff leaders, with the director, with other managers and senior managers across the org. I was in quite a few hours at the very beginning. It does actually happen, started in the interview process, where when I was interviewing at this level, when you're interviewing for something like a staff plus position, a lot of the future landscape and the future scope of what this team is going to do, what your job is going to be when you come on, those are very critical, important details to when you're actually looking for a new job. So I actually got pulled into, for example, some details about what is going to happen in the next couple quarters. What is the roadmap? What is our plan? And so that kind of discussion had already started with the hiring manager and the director from before I even got hired, and then it carried on through the first couple weeks of onboarding. So I was doing the traditional onboarding thing where you get the laptop and you set it up and you set up all those things at the same time as also squeezing in as many meetings as I could and participating in as many design sessions as design sessions and other discussion groups across the organization just to be able to get my hands onto that.
Yeah, something else you said reminded me. I think I had 20 to 25 coffee chats with different people, either in my org or in peripheral orgs when I started. It's just a way to get to know people because you end up interacting a lot with people outside of your immediate team.
Yep, it's an extremely common, like the actual team that you're directly on, like whatever manager or director or whatever whatever person you report to, becomes a lot less important once you get to this kind of level because your work is about org level. You're the leader for example, say that team, but you're also expected to sort of plan things at a yearly level or an organizational level. So there's a lot more that's going on that isn't specific to your direct reporting structure.
Oh, that's cool. Carl, do you have any input on this as well?
Yeah, I guess one of the things that I generally try and look for is problems that I might be able to spot based on my experience and just having fresh eyes at a company. I think one of the advantages you have when you are initially joining an organization is that you don't have the like calcified scars that everyone else does. You know, like by the time there are problems on a team or at an organization, they don't appear out of nowhere. So by the time people realize that there is a problem, a lot of the time there's just so much history that people don't realize that it really is a problem. You know, I think that coming in with fresh eyes, you can spot issues that are invisible to other people. Or, you know, maybe other people know that they're there, but they believe that the solution to it is too hard to implement or would take too much buy-in or whatever. So I think having that fresh perspective is an advantage in itself. You have to remember that your fresh perspective is coupled with a lack of context. So when you're trying to raise problems, you have to be delicate about it and try and gather context while also raising it. I think one of my most impactful first months at a company was at the largest company I've worked for. They had been dealing with it was basically a glorified brochure site. It was a very complex website, but it was basically information designed to sell a product. And they had initially built it as a static website, then realized for SEO reasons they needed server rendering, and so it was all very packed in after the fact. And one of the major holdovers from that. One of the symptoms that indicated to me that it was very hacked together was that the build process took 2.5 minutes for every single iteration. So every time you changed code, you had to kill the server and restart it, and it took 2.5 minutes to build. So my first week there, I said, I can't do this. This is outrageous. I'm going to run this 50 times a day. Spent 1 week with 2 other new joiners, and we got that down to under 10 seconds. That was just a problem that partly because I had the technical experience with the build systems they were using to know how to do it better. It was also just partly because I was brought in, I didn't really have tasks to do, I had that freedom to just sort of hack on something and try and make it better. So I think that freedom when you're first joining is a pretty strong advantage, or can be a pretty strong advantage.
Awesome. Thanks for your input and everyone's input on this question. We have a member requesting to speak, raise their hand. Shugs, I'm inviting you. Feel free to ask your question here if you have one.
Hi there. How are you guys?
Doing all right. Yourself?
Yeah, great. Thanks for doing this and thanks for having me on. My question is just regarding like cost estimating web design projects. So currently I'm a sole proprietor and I do a lot of work with various clients where, they just request sort of a website or some sort of software. And I find one of the hardest things to do is sort of perform requirements gathering and then really break those down into costs. And then also comparing how much you're charging for each of those requirements to kind of what's the industry standard. So I guess the question is like, how do you value your work as a self-proprietor in terms of like how much you pay yourself hourly, and how do you really break down all the costs and requirements for sort of a big web design project? Thanks.
Right. So you're asking kind of along the lines of how do you figure out how long each project takes and then evaluate the cost based on that time?
Totally. And especially like if you're not a salaried employee and you're doing it all yourself, it's really important that you do a lot of estimation up front. So yeah, that's the whole question.
Cool. I'm going to move you back to the audience while we have our members answer what they can. Thanks for the question.
Cool.
Sky, do you want to take this?
Yeah, so I have to lead off with just saying I have not worked as a sole proprietor or like a 1099 contractor or anything before. I've worked my entire career as a W-2 salaried employee. So I can't necessarily tell you about freelance work or how to what kind of market value or estimate numbers you can come up with that. But on a related kind of thing, at least, the ability to be able to estimate what something is going to take, breaking down a project into the different components and how long, say like workloads or tasks, and how long each of those will take, and can we do this in 2 quarters with 3 versus 50%, upload or anything like that. Those are definitely skills that are very important at the kind of sort of senior plus level where you're leading projects, because when you actually go into a project, for example, something that will usually happen is before a quarter or before a half will start, we'll get a bunch of people sitting around in a room, maybe managers, some senior and staff engineers, and we'll have some projects that we're going to try to be putting onto the roadmap. And with those projects, we will usually have come in with maybe some sort of design document or one pager, with then some sort of estimates on there saying like, oh, we want to make a new page on the website that does X feature, right? And to be able to do that, what kind of tasks does it take? We need someone who sets up some database tables, right? Do we need to set up some sort of NoSQL? Do we need to have a requisition any new hardware, or is it just already going to be there? Right. So these kind of things, you break it down into the smaller manageable pieces, and then you can start ascribing numbers to it. In this case, we don't generally say like it costs $100,000 because we're not measuring in people's salary. But we will generally say something like it'll cost maybe like 1 junior engineer working on this full time for 2 weeks for this task, right? Maybe like in total for 2 months we need them for that time. And then in terms of the actual numbers, there are some hard numbers, such as how much is this going to cost in AWS when we deploy, or how much is this going to cost in terms of hardware hosting costs, right? But the part where there's going to be some disconnect with what your original question was is there is an extra step after that when you're freelancing or doing your own work or running your own company, which is translating that into how much can I charge or how much is this worth to a customer. And that's something that I'm going to hand off to other people to answer because I don't have the answer for that.
Yeah, I think this is a really, really great question. And honestly, I think we probably should do another type of event purely for this topic because there's so many factors that go into this. But I think one of the things to really think through is that you have to do change management at some point. You can't just say, I'm going to have a scope of work and do whatever the customer asks. You have to have a plan for that because where people really get burned is the scope increases. And then they get, oh, what about this? What about this? What about this? And suddenly you're doing 2, 3, 4 times as much energy as you do. And I think also another factor is that I have very rarely seen people charge or even set a cost that's as high as what is reasonable. Because with salaried employee, you have a ton of benefits. And like the rule of thumb I like to tell people is take your annual salary and divide it by 1,000, and that should be about your hourly rate. So like if you're making 100,000 a year, you should charge close to $100 an hour to be roughly equivalent. And that's because benefits are really expensive. You have time off, you have like maybe you have a 401k match, you have social security taxes that your company's paying, you have training types of things. You've got PTO, you've got sick time. There's a ton of stuff like that, and I find most people just really underestimate that. And I think adding to what Sai said, just there's a lot of complexity that goes into planning out project work.
Henry, I think you broke up there a little bit.
Yeah, my audio went nuts. Sorry. So I don't know, Carl, if you would want to talk on the front end side of things here a little bit more. I think you have a lot more familiarity with that than either Sai or myself does.
Yeah, sure. I've never worked as a freelancer or had to do precisely what you're talking about. I have put a little bit of thought into that where we've tried to answer, how really, I guess what sort of the, one level away from what you're asking is how long will this take? Because if you say, I want to pay myself at this hourly rate, and really in order to answer the question of how much will this cost is how long will it take? And I mean, the problem is that for software projects, like that's just a really hard question to answer generally. I think I'm not sure exactly in what context you're asking. I'm not sure if you're asking as yourself as a, like freelancer doing contract work for individuals. If that's the case, then I think really, if you're building websites for people, then I think the situation that is my understanding of how that work generally unfolds is the first couple of times you do something, you don't really know how much it's going to cost. So you have to kind of do a rough estimate. Okay, I think this will take me a month. I want to pay myself this rate, so I will, I'll invoice them for this much. And sometimes you're going to massively undershoot, and you can either, you've made a bunch more money than you expected. Sometimes you're going to massively overshoot, and well, shit, either you've got to bill them for time, and that's where you have to really have a contract in place with whoever you're building something for. You need to defend yourself and say, what happens if this goes way over? What happens if this goes way under? My understanding of how that work generally goes is as you kind of find a niche and you find what you build for people, you select for clients that want what you can do quickly and reliably, and then it becomes much easier to build because you know how long it's going to take because you've already done it for 10 people. You can both optimize it by building tools for yourself and reusable things that you can cut that time down substantially, and you can estimate it better, and you can reduce the reduce how many unknowns you're dealing with. I think when you're starting out, there's just a ton of unknowns, and you really just have to kind of wing it and figure it out on the fly a little bit. I guess another way you can try and do that without burning a bunch of bridges as you do contract work is like build a portfolio, build projects for yourself. And so you're not getting paid, but now you've done this once. You have a rough sense of how long it's going to take. You've done it before. You have somewhere to start when you're doing contract work for someone. Yeah, so I think that's all I have to say on that.
Cool. Well, thanks for the answers on this, and thanks again, Shugs, for the question. Let's move on to the next question. What were the strategies and decisions that moved you from senior level role to a staff level role? And I could assume it's probably the same from mid-level to senior. Carl, do you want to start this one?
Sorry, I was reading chat. Can you say that question again?
Yeah, so what were the strategies and decisions that moved you from a senior level role to a staff level role?
Well, I am still in a senior level role, so I may not be the best person to answer this.
It could probably apply mid-level to senior as well, since this is a senior and above.
And I did move into a management role for a time. Yeah, I guess no, I didn't really have a plan or a strategy for it. I just spent a lot of time investing in my skills and participating in communities. Honestly, one of the things that I did grow my skills the most was I joined a chat room and just tried to answer everyone's question. I think that one of the advantages of that was I just encountered a ton of real world situations that people were hitting, and they're all answerable. So just by talking to them and investing the time to see, okay, here's this weird hairy problem. Like, maybe it's a typo in their code, or maybe it's incompatibility between dependencies or whatever. Maybe it's a problem, like an algorithmic kind of problem they're trying to fix, trying to figure out. But yeah, I think maybe that's more for like junior to mid level. Like a semi-joke, but actually serious thing that I've said before is that one measure of seniority is how many documents you're asked to produce. I think that as you get into a senior role, you are asked to do a lot more like scoping, estimation, and planning. So you're not just writing the code, you're saying, okay, we want to do this. In order to do that, we will be able to move fastest on it if we use these tools. And I think the final product using those tools will look like this. And take all that information and produce a 5-page document or a presentation or whatever, and disseminate it to the team or give the presentation to your manager or the stakeholders and things like that.
Yeah, I think something I would add to that is I found myself just continually thinking about problems that were more at my manager's kind of scope of influence. And over time, the more you kind of see those problems and are interested in those problems, the more likely you end up to move into those roles. Because I think a lot of people see, especially to staff, but I think even to senior sometimes this way too, where it's like the same work, but more of it or something. And that's really not often what is the case. It's more a different type of work. Like I have conversations with people, peers in different orgs, and I'm planning out that sort of thing. And it's because you have to be interested in that sort of things. Sai and I were talking about that at the beginning here when you started a company and just meet people because they're all people you interact with. And I think for me, that was kind of where the transition point was recognizing that the types of problems I liked solving were much larger than one team. And in a lot of cases, I think you could be a senior engineer on a team and kind of have a sphere of responsibility that's either one team or maybe your adjacent team. But once you start talking staff, you have to consider your org level responsibilities. And I think if you're not interested in that, I would definitely not go down this route, by the way. I think you'll have a very frustrating experience at best, and you'll probably burn out of it because it's a lot of overhead. So I don't know if you want to add to that too.
Yeah, so on that topic, I 100% agree with what Ender said about how I like to say this to a lot of people, but the skill set that you have at starting at senior, especially much so more once you get to staff and even higher roles, it goes entirely away from your traditional I'm a good coder, I can write lots of code, I can burn through lots of tickets in Jira as fast as I can, right? And turns into a management role. It's not people management, that's what a software engineering manager does, but it is in itself still leadership and management, and that becomes your main role at the staff level. So what that really means is, adding on to what Ender said, if that's not your interest, right? If your interest is I just want to write code, I am an amazing coder, there are certain companies, like for example, Facebook, who does have an archetype for staff level plus engineers to just be code machines and pump out lots of code and be that, rock star, 10x I can write code engineer. But for the most part, I'm going to say like 95% of staff engineers in the industry are spending most of their time not writing code, but in doing things like planning out a project and breaking it down and thinking about what kind of new projects can we do that would bring more value, bringing more value multiplicatively to the company and to the team, right? And like thinking about those kinds of things and then being able to see them through is sort of the skill set that you need. On the topic of how do you get there. So in my particular case, and this is something that's pretty common with some of my friends and colleagues as well, who have had similar journeys where they started, as some sort of as like an entry level engineer, and then within the next 5 to 10 years, they managed to make their way up to senior staff at a fairly quick pace. A lot of it came down to both you want to do it. In my case, I really like to help people. I really like to collaborate with people. I don't like to just sit there and work by myself. So that was pretty natural of a fit. But then on top of that, you need to have that sort of drive for that kind of skill set, as well as the opportunity. Because if you're on a team, right, and this happens a lot. I don't know, this is not necessarily a good or a bad thing, but this is just something that can or cannot happen. If you're on a team that's already extremely mature, say like you join a team that has you say you join a team at Google and it's a Google search team, and then like everyone in the team has already been there for like 10 years. It's a lot harder to end up on that kind of trajectory or that kind of growth because you end up getting limited by the opportunities, right? Like no team needs 6 staff engineers, right? Like an org maybe has like 100-person org maybe has 6 staff engineers in total, right? Across all the teams. You don't need an entire giant pile of staff engineers. So if you join a mature team that already has a ton of technical leadership, there just isn't the scope needed to be able to have another one or another one or another one. In my particular case, I joined a team that out of college as a completely new grad back in 2014, starting as a junior software engineer, and my team at that time had about 10 people on it. And that was 10 people at the entire company, and we were supposed to do everything regarding payments and e-commerce, which is a huge task, right? And then over the next 7 years, as I grew, I basically grew along with the team. And then by about 4 or 5 years in, I had become one of the most veteran people on the team because now it was like a 50, 60 person team. And then by the time I left, it was like over 100 people. So growing along with that team size meant that as one of the original veterans and the leaders of this team, I got to grow with that team as fast as it grew. And that's what landed me in that staff position because I ended up needing to I was sort of the go-to person for here's this problem that we need to solve. You have a lot of knowledge on how to solve it at a very high level. Can you lead this project? Can you do this? Right? I got asked this a lot by management on how to lead a project until eventually the sort of project that pushed me over to the staff level was there ended up being like this multi-billion-dollar migration project where we needed to move an entire ecosystem from one system to another system, and it involved probably a couple hundred people across the company. And the director of the organization was just like, "Hey, can you lead this project because I trust you. We've worked together for so many years. I'm sure you'll do a great job at it." And I was like, "Yeah, sure, I'll go ahead and do it." Right. And so that's that. This is not necessarily typical. I think there's a lot of cases where people who are perhaps more hungry for advancement might try to seek out these opportunities more actively. I definitely got a lot pushed onto me, which is lucky in some ways, but it definitely requires to get to this level. It requires you to think of things in a very different way, and it's not and transition yourself away from coding. So going back to what Ender said, if that's not something that appeals to you, it's going to be a very tough time trying to go for it, because if it's something that you don't like doing, it's going to be hard to excel at that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what I find myself doing is more trying to understand the larger technical picture and working with the right people and knowing who the right people are to actually get them to necessarily know what they need to do. It's definitely not, I definitely am not in like a coding machine type of situation either, although there's definitely days I wish I could just close Slack and close Zoom and never have to look at those. But like a lot of it is being able to coordinate those things. So Sai and I both were joking about this in the actual event chat, and neither of us talked about this. We write a lot of docs, I think. I've written the roadmap for 2021 in 2 different companies now for my team. I wrote this in my last company, and then I took a new job and ended up writing it again for this current company. And I think there's a lot of things like that where you end up really taking ownership, especially on the technical aspects of what your manager's sphere is. And you can do that even if your team doesn't necessarily have to grow. If because generally most engineers don't want to do that sort of work. I think a large percentage of the engineers I've worked with just want to write code and don't want to have to do with meetings, don't want to have to write docs. They just want to write code. And so if you want to do that, there's often a lot of opportunities for that. And if you like docs, hopefully you like docs if you want to do staff engineer type of work.
Then
Oh, well.
one final last thing to add on, just a 10-second tidbit here. If you make senior at something like Big N, the jump to staff, if you're somebody who's worried like, oh, but what about the money, right? You're not actually gonna get like staff. I think gets like maybe 20-30% more than senior, which sounds like a big number, but once you make senior at something like Big N, you're probably gonna end up pulling something like 350 to 500K anyways. With staff, you'll get like another 100K or 200K, of which half that's you're gonna pay to taxes. So don't feel bad if that's not something you don't enjoy, because it's not like you're going to lose out on fat sacks of cash or anything like that. Like, this is not something where you shouldn't be thinking about as going in for the money, because it's not actually that much better here.
Yeah, I was gonna say I've seen Amazon where you can have a terminal role at just L5, which is a mid-level engineer, although depending on other places it's considered senior as well. So stopping and just coding all day is an option, but even then you're still expected to write docs, you're still expected to write a PRFAQ occasionally, so that makes sense. Cool. Well, thanks for the answers on that. Let's move to the next question. Once I find the question chat. So Reno had 4 questions. I'm not going to ask all 4 yet, so we'll kind of start with one. How much of your time, at least percentage-wise, do you spend mentoring junior engineers?
Well, the company I work for, we don't have a ton of junior folks, so it's a pretty small percentage. Would estimate probably like 10%. In the past, in senior roles I've had, that's been much greater. Where we've had more. Right now, I'd say everyone I work with who isn't senior is more closer to mid-level, and like most of them are pushing senior at this point. In the past, I'd say that's been closer to 30 or 50%, and that in the form of making myself available for pair programming or organizing lunch and learns on some topic, or just directly answering questions. Where some of those ends up being pretty similar to volunteer work I've done in chat rooms, where somebody asks a question like, "Hey, I'm stuck on this. I can't get past some technical thing," and helping them understand what they've done wrong. Yeah, so currently about 10%, but it's been up to half of my time, I'd say.
So, sorry. Let me just go first. So in my case, I just changed companies. So right now, 0% technically, because I have not started on that. It'll probably be like another couple of months before I get into like the whole starting to interview and starting to mentor and that kind of work, because right now it's more about onboarding and getting used to the company and everything. But back at my previous job, I think it also depends on what you're counting as mentorship, right? If you're talking about something like direct face-to-face time, hey, I'm sitting down with a one-on-one with a junior and discussing, like AMA, what do you want to ask of someone who's more senior, right? Or what do you want to discuss about, like, say, potential career growth opportunities? That would probably be something like maybe 5% at most. But then if you're including things like, hey, I'm going to sit down with you and go over your design with you, or I'm going to sit down with you and review your code with you, or pair program with you, I would probably say I probably spent something closer to like 15 or 20% of my time doing that, because a lot of it overlaps with your job, right? Your job is to oversee a lot of projects and a lot of code and a lot of these happenings that are happening. And a hallmark of a good leader is not just telling them, hey, you're wrong, go and figure it out. It's sitting down and taking the time to make sure that we all understand what's going on, that it becomes a learning experience, that it becomes an opportunity for growth, right? So if somebody submits an RB and there's something that's wrong on it, even the simple act of typing in a nice comment that details out, this is why we should probably do it this other way. Maybe if you are still confused, we can just set up a time or come over, drop by my desk, and we can talk about it. That to me is still mentorship, and if you count those kinds of things, it's definitely closer to like a quarter of my time.
Yeah, so this is an interesting question for me because in a lot of ways, this is why I was hired. So I'm an engineer, but I'm in the QA org here, and we're undergoing a fairly messy transition from more of a manualish QA approach to actually having people write code and be engineers. And so a huge percentage of my time goes towards trying to help people understand like all levels of programming types of stuff. Um, I don't know if I'd say it's more than 30 or 40% of my time, but a lot of it goes to that because what I'm trying to do is really build the senior engineer folks in our org up so that they can mentor other people. And that's been a challenge that we have had in my org. And that's basically why they hired me. And I think even though in my previous companies, I've spent a lot of time doing this because again, it's you start caring about the team and the team dynamics and the team health, and you start to see, okay, this person needs help with this, or people start seeing you as, hey, Ender's got good abilities to help me with fill in the blank here, and you start just doing that. Like I was thinking, kind of, Carl, when you were talking, both my previous companies, I spent a lot of time doing this in various capacities, whether that's facilitating internal groups, different roundtables, and that sort of thing. And it's really, I think it is kind of part of what I think also does help. You have like grow people in your org. My audio is crappy apparently.
Also there for a second under.
Yeah. And you have to be able to do that. That's I think part of being a staff level person is you have to see how do we multiply this org, and you can't have only juniors in an org and keep it that way. I think as a staff you have to be careful though because you could spend your entire day, all day, every day working with people, either coaching them on code reviews like Sai said, or just in general like one-on-one time. Um, I think this is a conversation topic I have with my manager actively around how much of my time really should I be doing that because you can spend 0% up to 100%.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's always I'm always curious myself about mentoring because I have my own mentoring kind of down from my level, but I go with like staff, principal engineers, and senior engineers when I need a mentor. So it's great to hear from that side.
I think one misconception I think people have around mentorship is they feel it has to be this very formal thing where I asked, hey, will you be my mentor? Yes, I'll be your mentor. Let's sit down and have a conversation. And while that is certainly something I did, especially early in my career, I think a lot of mentorship really is kind of an informal process. And I think you can do that pretty much whatever level you're at because once you're at a company a while, you start knowing and you learn things that other people don't know. Almost every engineer, anyone on this call knows things that other people don't know, and they can effectively mentor people around that.
This is why at the beginning with my answer, I was talking a lot about how it depends on what you're counting as mentorship, right? Because in my view, all of that time that you're just helping people isn't itself mentorship, right? If someone slacks you a message saying, hey, this thing isn't working and I've been stuck on it for 3 hours and I really need some help, that is in itself a lot of times mentorship because you're giving them the experience. Sometimes a lot of times there's other learning experiences other than solving that exact problem, right? Sometimes it leads into like a lunchtime discussion with a colleague on, hey, what did you do to get to your level, right? And these kinds of chats and these kind of informal situations, those make up the bulk of mentorship in my opinion. The actual formal let's schedule you a mentor and have a 30-minute one-on-one is like a tiny fraction of what you actually do.
Oh yeah, that makes sense. So we have Chompy who requested to ask a question as well. What question do you have, Chompy?
Hey guys, just want to say awesome you guys are coming on board here and sharing your experiences. Really, really helpful for the rest of the people who are anywhere from like various stages in their experiences. So I just want to say thanks for that. One of the questions that I had specifically was more so around, I guess like getting buy-in from management, and when you're in those positions where, like, how do you sell new ideas to management? Where, for example, your direct managers or their direct managers have preconceived notions and standards from companies that they've been in on how processes should be done versus how you'd like to enact change on that. And then also establishing that buy-in and consensus, as well as enforcing that change through the technical applications and architectures that you work to implement in your projects.
Scott, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So if I understand your question correctly, you're talking about how do you sell an idea? Is that the general question you're asking here?
Yeah. Basically, how do you sell that idea and then just keep everyone on board as you work to deliver that project
Okay,
through?
okay. So for this question, there's like an art to it and a science to it, right? Because you have two different components, right? One of them is because it's engineering, right? You're gonna want to back any proposal up with hard facts. So if I come in with MongoDB versus Oracle SQL, right, as like a storage system, I'm going to want to come prepared to any sort of sales pitch or any sort of design discussion meeting with a pro and con chart of, hey, this is going to do this, hey, that's going to do that. This is going to cost us less money, but this one's going to be more scalable in the future. This one has more support in our current ecosystem because the DB and data team is promoting, say, Mongo as opposed to SQL databases, which they're trying to drop support of, right? So doing that homework and doing that research involves, say, talking to the data team on what their suggested best practices are, and then thinking over your own experience with these two and trying to match it up with your problem at hand, right? So there's this technical homework that you go do, and you bring those cold hard facts to the table. But there's also, on the other hand, a more sort of the soft skills and the art to it, which ties into why staff, like a staff level or leadership role, is so different from the more junior or mid-level engineering roles, is because it becomes a lot more about the soft skills than it did before, right? There's a lot of successful junior, mid-level, even senior engineers who they may not be the best at trying to communicate or dealing with that kind of thing, and they're not a big fan of, say, meetings or talking or that kind of thing. And that's fine because they're sitting there and they pump through a lot of code and they they do a lot of Jira tickets, and they're really solid people when you actually ask them for like some input on, for example, that technical pro and cons list that you were talking about, right? But then there's an element of charisma, right? An element of, say, public speaking. There's a lot of courses and lessons that I've done at work, both at and outside of work, for things like I never participated in this, but a lot of my fellow staff engineers and managers have done this thing called Toastmasters, which is basically just a public speaking. I don't think it's a course. It's more like a group, and it's like a group where people just get together and practice their public speaking, right? So those kinds of skills become very important, because how to present something, how to be very confident when you're doing it, how to be charismatic while you're talking, and making sure you even like something we were talking about in event chat and event questions about pronunciation, enunciation, and getting your point across, right? Those are extremely important skills, and those will inevitably help you sell anything, right? Not just the technical idea, but also something that may be a little bit more of a dream, or more of a more less technical in nature, and more of a say, like, a, what's the word for it? Pie, like moonshot kind of idea, right? There's like crazy ideas I've had where it's like, oh, can we do this? And we don't necessarily have the numbers for it yet, but maybe this is going to have all these great things, right? Sometimes you can sell people on that aspect as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying, and I think two comments I'll add. The first is that I think a lot of times where people really struggle at this is that within the context of a team, normally you're just trying to convince people who are very familiar with either your immediate work or the immediate project work that you're doing, and so you can talk almost entirely technical on that, and people will sort of just assume and understand why you're saying the things and proposing the things that you're doing. When you start talking outside of your team and you start talking at larger scale projects, people have no context whatsoever in a lot of cases, and so you might say, "Hey, we should do this," and they look at you like, "That's cool. I have no idea why." And so the other thing that I've used this analogy a lot, and I think what Sai was saying is absolutely the case. And the way that I've thought about that when it comes to communication is every time we're communicating something, we have an idea in our head that we're trying to communicate. And I like to think of it as an iceberg. So if I'm trying to communicate, say, why you should care about communication, there's a whole bunch of underlying thoughts that I have that relatively rarely do people communicate by default. So I might tell you, hey, it's really important to communicate. You should communicate. You should do this. That's kind of like what's above the water with the iceberg. There's a whole realm of things under the water, and those are the types of things that they're motivating you. They're
Dude, you really
outcomes.
need to fix your
No, it's
audio.
my push to talk has like a timeout on it apparently. So there's tons of context that you have that you need to share, and as far as being able to, you want to basically convince someone of what your idea is, and if you're wrong, then you want to know that too. And the only way to really do that is to really understand what and why you're saying what you are, and actually communicate that. I think in general, this is where a lot of people fail at trying to be persuasive, is that they just assume that the person that they're trying to persuade has all of the context that they have. And that's almost never true. And especially when you're talking in the staff or senior levels, you're almost always talking to people with minimal context or different context, which is even worse because now you've communicated an idea that you think you're on the same page as the person with. And it turns out you're not. And so you put it into a document somewhere and then they look at you like you're from a different planet. And I really think like, it's like a tactical thing if you're thinking about how to do these sorts of projects, really understanding your audience and understanding what you know and what they don't know and what context needs to go into it is really important.
And it's, on what Andrew was just saying, I think one of the only ways that I've really found helpful for myself of actually doing that is just taking a lot of notes. So like when I found repeatedly through my career, I found that I know all of these things about the problems in an app. Like the rough edges and the corner cases and all the small things that make it hard to do. They're like basically the things that I want to advocate fixing. Whether it's a new feature or some bit of tech debt or whatever. The only real way I've found that I've been able to advocate to get those things done is when I've taken a lot of notes and I can actually say, I can take those notes and turn them into a document or a presentation and just have like a very comprehensive breakdown of here's the problem that we're experiencing, and these very detailed breakdown, and here is what the solution is, and here is why it's better. So I just think that that's one of the that's something that I have forgotten to do a number of times in my career, and I've always regretted it. So I am a strong advocate of taking a lot of notes on all sorts of subjects as you're working.
Yeah, and I think another aspect to that is making sure you're actually communicating the impact of what you're doing and what the actual like value proposition is, rather than just assuming people understand that. And I think your notes that you're describing, Carl, that's actually a really great way to do that, because if you have it on paper, it's really easy to see it. Or virtual paper. Nobody uses real paper this day.
I still do occasionally, but yeah.
All of my notes exist only in unsaved Sublime text windows.
I do that too, yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks for the question. Let's move on to, I guess, mine in this case. And since I'm the host, I get to elaborate. Kind of as you grow in the ranks, your expectation of architectural approaches grow. So, as a junior engineer, even an intern, your 1 to 2 pager is, hey, I'm going to write this code and test like this. Mid-level, you start thinking about full picture system designs, and senior, you go full multi-team. How is your approach? At least that's my experience. But how has your approach changed the more senior you got, and what's it look like now?
So I can answer this one from my perspective, and then I'd be curious the other folks. But I think what really changes for me is understanding how the organizational dynamics and the people involved can actually influence some of the decisions that you're making. Because, I was just talking about the impact. Really, the impact of anything we're doing is, if you want to be really kind of down to the root thing, is it's to make our company more money. And balancing all of the different people factors with, we really want to actually do something that's, value add, is one of the things I think is the biggest surprise for me. I've never really had to deal with that on an individual team basis, because I think for the most part, the value add of what we're doing is already defined, whether that's in some sort of, yearly plan or strategic headcount allocation, whatever. But when you're actually starting to make these decisions and be involved in them, you start realizing, oh, there's people that are evaluating, is this worth it? Is it worth 10, headcount or 10 engineers for a year to do this versus 5 or you, those sorts of things? And what are those people involved and does it make sense?
Yeah, I think that elaborates on a question we had earlier of evaluating time on each part of the question. Carl, do you have any input on this?
I don't know. I think maybe it's because of how my career has progressed, where I've always remained more as a front end developer. Basically everything I'm adding is pretty much some sort of new feature or some sort of new project, and there hasn't really been that much of a growth in architectural scope. Sometimes it'll be, I guess relative to like a junior front-end engineer, they're basically gonna use a bunch of existing tools in the app to complete a feature. Like the network requests and the retry logic and the error handling. That's all probably already been done. So now it's in my scope to really build all of that from scratch. I guess in that sense, I do have to think of a broader scope, and I do have to think of the complete life cycle of everything. Like, where does this get persisted? How does this get loaded? But really, I don't really feel like the architectural scope of my work has really expanded that much over my career.
Cool, Scotty, you have anything?
Yeah, and then for my end, I'm gonna give a very similar non-answer as Carl here, where I don't think it's like a oh, I did this when I was senior and I did that when I was staff, and more just say I learned more as the years went on. So when I was staff, I had more experience and more knowledge than when I was senior. So I don't think it's necessarily a role difference here, because when you're thinking about architecture design or you're thinking about how do I design this project, you're not trying to come up with the bad design, right? It doesn't matter if you're senior or staff. Like if you're senior, it's not like you're trying to come up with a intentionally worse one than if you were staff. I think the difference doesn't come from the title, it comes from that experience that you get from time and get from leading larger and larger scope projects and thinking about these problems at a larger and larger scale. And I think that makes the difference here. In terms of the general rule of thumb scoping that I think Andrew had touched upon before, at senior level, you're probably working on your team level. You're probably leading, say, one project on your team, and you have like some more junior mid-level engineers working on your project with you. At a staff level, you're thinking about projects more on the multi-team scale, right? Like you're thinking about a project that will affect multiple teams, probably the entire organization. Are there initiatives or are there say like are there best practices that I can help come up with to be able to improve, say, the process for checking in across the entire organization, right? Those are the kind of skills of problems that you're thinking about. So it's not really comparable because it's a scope difference here, and when it gets bigger, it's not like it also doesn't necessarily change that much, other than in the sort of more subtle ways that you really just get the feel out as you get thrown into it.
Yeah, and I guess sort of what you said towards the end there made me think of this. I am expected to be on the lookout for non-technical problems as well. So, things like what does our task tracking process look like? What does our QA process look like? Are we drowning in testing new releases because we don't have enough automated tests and we have to manually test everything? So I am thinking in that sort of scope. On the purely technical aspects, yeah, I'd agree with what you said about what Sky said about you just kind of know more and you do more because you have that knowledge.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I'm gonna move on to the next question. Thanks for answering that. I'm gonna merge two questions in one since they kind of are the same thing but opposites. This may ask a little too much, so feel free to skip it if you want to. But what are some of the biggest successes, or what is your biggest professional success? And on the opposite side, what's kind of your biggest failure so far, and what came from both of those?
Oh, I can go for the failure one. So I was this was some years ago now, but we were building your stereotypical event system. And the problem was that the people who were actually on the front end were expecting it to be a synchronous system. And so all of the validation that we were writing was a complete nightmare because we had an async system with nobody had designed any like observability or telemetry into this. This was a little bit before these sorts of backends were super popular. I think people understand this problem much better now than they did back when we were doing this, but it was very clear to me that this system was a train wreck as far as trying to understand what's going on, because it's effectively taking a synchronous request and making it asynchronous and making it like eventually consistent. And every single time the UI was going to use it, it would have to go through this process to say, hey, this is actually synchronous, right? Oh no, we don't know. And I think like one of the things that in hindsight was really obvious was that nobody was like really raising the flag that, hey, this is actually maybe not the right architecture for this whole system. And that whole project after I changed teams actually eventually just got scrapped. That was like 2 years of, geez, probably 10 people who were working on that project. That was an expensive failure. And I think like the reason I'm mentioning this is because it's very clear to me what my issue was. And this is, I was not I guess I was technically a senior engineer at that point, but I was very junior for a senior engineer, is that there are sometimes things like that where everybody sees that there's an issue. Everybody knows that there's an issue, but nobody's willing to say it. And I think had someone said, hey, hold up a sec here, is this actually the right architecture for what the clients are going to use, or do we need to add additional stuff into this, or what's going on? I don't know if anybody else wants to take a failure or a success. Go for it.
Okay, so in my case, I'm actually going to talk about the same thing. It was both probably one of the biggest successes I've had, as well as one of the biggest failures, just at different points in the project. So this was I think I mentioned this earlier. It was this giant migration effort where we were trying to move from an old system that was based on Salesforce as a core CRM and a whole bunch of individual business processes within Salesforce onto a completely new stack that we had just built. And also, I think we were moving into Microsoft, whatever the Microsoft CRM, Dynamics 365 was the replacement CRM for this. And so that was just gigantic migration effort that was going on. And because our project was slated to launch live in about 3 months' time, we had like a hard deadline of you need to do this and pull it off in 3 months. So this was in itself a huge time crunch, because trying to do that amount of planning, that amount of effort in a 3-month time with a hard deadline is a pretty looming specter to have to face. So we did our best. I think everyone on the team definitely put in 120% that during that time. This was one of the few times in my career where for that 3-month period I was crunching for a lot of it, and I ended up working probably something like 50 to 60 hours a week for a lot of that. Wasn't the best experience, and I haven't had to do that again, thankfully, or before, but it did end up happening for that time. And even by the end of the 3 months, we sort of tried to launch it in the alpha release, and it sort of worked. There was a lot of limitations with the migration. For example, we couldn't really roll it back. It was kind of one shot. It had to work in one go. Since this was live in production, how do we test it? Because we can't use the production data in our development test environment because it's got a bunch of PII, which is personally identifiable information, which is like names and phone numbers and etc., that you can't bring into the development test environment. So there's a whole lot of issues that were surrounding this that made the migration is kind of a failure, right? Like I think in terms of allowing us to launch the product on the purported date, it was technically a success. But then from an actual behind the scenes technical perspective, we all pretty much considered it mostly a failure in that we needed to redesign this to make it work for anything bigger in the future. So then we went back to drawing board, but now the timeline had been, this timeline constraint had been removed because we had hit that launch date and we didn't have to worry about that anymore. And then the later deadlines were a lot more looser. And so we went back to the drawing board and we redesigned a whole lot of it, this time with more resources, more timing, with more etc. and turned out to be a much better success in the end. We ended up building a lot of, we actually ended up leveraging a lot of what we built for this particular migration for other future products, because we built a production testing environment. We built a system to be able to test in production and roll it back without affecting any users, so kind of like a ghost or shadow mode. So a lot of the technical improvements that we made to make this project a eventual huge success were actually useful for future projects, because it solved a lot of those problems that were hard problems, like how do we test in production versus how do we test in tests, for in a more generic case than we had previously anticipated, and that ended up being probably one of the biggest wins, not just in the project sense, but also in the future for the company and the organization sense.
Yeah, I've had the most time of any of the three of us to think about this, and I don't really think that I've had like a failure in my career. I've had a lot of things that didn't go great. I've had some projects that I'm fortunate at my current company to where engineering, within the scope of what we're asked to do, we have a lot of leeway to define what success looks like. So, I had a project where we revamped the documentation, and we evaluated a couple of options and chose to write it from scratch using we basically wrote our own documentation engine with a pretty specific design. And basically, it just ended up dragging on and on and on and on, where I thought that I had initially validated that the design would be relatively easy to implement, and the scope of what we were building would be, I tried to evaluate performance challenges and things like that. And it just turned out that the ways that I had evaluated it were not close enough to reality to have been proper validation. So it ended up where basically the issue we ran into was we wanted to have one single page was generated from like 30 separate markdown documents and routed as where different URLs took you to different parts of the page. It all works. I did ship something, it did work. I had a very dark moment at like 2 in the morning, like a week before we were hoping to launch. I realized that that one page was loading like 16 megabytes of HTML. And after like 10 hours of debugging and, just like one long day that never ended because I was just really trying to fix it, it turned out that the syntax highlighting, because this is technical documentation, was like 10 megabytes it was generating like 10 megabytes of HTML. And so I ended up having to move that into client rendering only and lazy rendering in order to make it work. So like it didn't go great in that it overran what we wanted by a pretty substantial amount of time. I've had other projects that, I remember one of I talked about this company in our last AMA, but I was basically writing Hadoop data ingesters. And it was like my first big project on it, and it was a weird integration, and it ended up taking like a month instead of the like week that they wanted. But that was my failure. Like it was my first thing. Like they shouldn't have thrown me a weird curveball as my first at bat. I was doing my best, but I didn't have Java. I had never worked in Java outside of college, and I just remember one day I walked into stand up just in time to hear the VP of sales say, "This is all Carl's fault." And less than a month later, they tried to put me on a performance improvement plan that I refused to sign because because it was bullshit, basically, and ended up quitting. So I've had there have been a number of things that didn't go well, and maybe this is just explaining it away, but generally I have viewed a lot of those as organizational failures rather than individual failures. It wasn't scoped properly. A validation attempts to prove out the solution we were trying to do ended up not being reflective of reality. Things like that. So I don't know. I think a lot of failures in engineering are, they're either learning experiences or they're collective failures, not individual failures.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've definitely seen the org level failures kind of come down on everyone else. And unfortunately, I haven't experienced too much where they try to throw everyone else under the bus like that, but it happens occasionally. All right, so moving on to the next question. I already kind of know everyone's answer on the second question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Any of you self-taught? And then part of that question is, have any of you faced imposter syndrome, and how do you get past that? And then, in addition to that, how did you know you're ready to make the jump from senior to staff, or in some cases, mid-level to senior?
So I'll jump in here because I regularly joke with people that I have a PhD in imposter syndrome, because I think it's so engineers we're basically, our job involves criticizing either our own code, other people's code, and we're very aware if you're, I'll call it a competent engineer, but I think as engineers learn more, you're more and more self-aware of the things you either don't know or the things that other people are better at. And I think it's very, very common to have imposter syndrome. I've had it in pretty much every job I've had, for that matter. My current job, previous job, job before that, it's kind of like, wow, I hope they don't find out that I'm not as perfect, or whatever the fill in the blank is. And I think so. I am self-taught. I think that empathizes a little bit because I can very easily go, well, somebody who has a CS degree would know X, Y, and Z, and I don't know that. And then I realize, well, if they had a CS degree, they would have done it 10 years ago, or 11, or geez, man, getting old. And I think, like, you just kind of have to realize, like, almost everybody who's competent is going to have some level of self-doubt or imposter syndrome in tech. I've almost never interacted with someone who's actually a really good engineer who's just totally self-confident and totally really good. Normally, that's the combination is like water and oil. Um, and I forgot the other part of this question, so I'll let someone else answer.
I think the other part was about when you're ready to make the jump.
Oh yeah.
As for that part of the question, I touched upon it before, but I don't think it was, for me at least, it wasn't really like a, I'm so ready to make the jump, I'm gonna now decide I'm gonna do all this extra work to try to make staff kind of thing. It just kind of happened because so one thing also, I think there's another question up in the chat. I'm gonna slightly answer here, where somebody was asking about, say you express to your boss you're interested in promotion to senior, and they express openness to the idea. How do you tell whether they're sincere about doing it or just stringing you along? And I think that question, I think that the madman asks, has a little bit of a fundamental misunderstanding that I think a lot of people, especially the junior or like, say, like, you're still in college level, have, which is they think that senior is just a junior engineer that can code better, and then a staff engineer is a senior engineer that can code even better. It's not really like that. Like, it's not, you're no one's going to get promoted to senior or getting promoted to staff because they get dumped twice the amount of work. Like, if you just do twice the amount of JIRA tickets, you don't get your staff promo, or you don't get your senior promo that way. Like, that almost never gets you the promotion, where you just get extra workload, because those are not the skills that you're supposed to be having for the leadership kind of role that a senior staff engineer is supposed to do, right? You're not trying to just be a better code engineer to be a senior or a staff engineer. What you're trying to do is you're supposed to be a good, engineer that can write code, but then also be good to great at all these other things that we've been talking about all night, such as leading a project, or be able to work with other teams and gather requirements and get all of that administration and alignment and collaboration done, right? Those kinds of skills are what you need to get that promotion. So I don't think it's about chasing senior or staff explicitly. It's more of a, if you're interested in that, it will come, right? Because if you're going to go ahead, and if you want to be a senior engineer or you want to be a staff engineer, your first step is almost always inevitably going to be, can I find an opportunity to lead a project, right? So ask your manager for, is there some opportunity where I can design a project, lead the design process, and have and be the sort of leader of this group of engineers that will be working on it, as opposed to the one who was just doing the tickets that someone else was assigned to me. Right, so that's kind of step one. And step two, which is very common at most companies, especially big end companies, is you usually have to be performing at the next level. for some amount of time, like 6 months to a year, before you can actually be put up for promotion to that level. If you go on somewhere like Blind, there'll be a lot of people complaining that like, oh, why should I have to do the extra work for the next level without getting paid like the next level, whatever. But I mean, like, I think that's a little bit naive to think of it that way, because in the end, the promotion needs to be based. It's reasonable for it to be based on your current capability that you've proven, as opposed to some future hopeful capability that you haven't proven yet. So what generally will happen is the pipeline is, I lead a project, it goes well, I might lead a second project, it also goes well. Those two projects over a span of like a year gives a lot of signal information that I'm ready to be that next promotion, because I'm already working at that level. It goes through, and that's how it goes. It's not about powering through more Jira tickets than before, or sort of like trying to do like more work, because I don't think my job is more work than it was before. It's just very different work.
Well, I think it was Ender that talked earlier, or Carl, I don't remember. I think you're up, Carl.
Yeah, sure. I'm kind of like half self-taught in that I have taken a lot of programming classes. I don't have a CS degree. I have a associate's in computer programming, not computer science. Yeah, I think that I have faced imposter syndrome. I think really, if you are challenging yourself, you will always face some degree of imposter syndrome, because when you're feeling challenged, you're not sure you can do it, and you're sure you can do it. You've probably done it before. So I think that overcoming imposter syndrome is really more of saying, I know that I will figure this out, not so much I know what to do. And yeah, I think Sky said really everything there is to say on making the jump. You are expected to perform at the level you will be promoted to for some period of time before you get there. Yeah, I think that's it.
One thing I'll add to that too is that I think a way you can make the jump relates to really a lot of what I was talking about earlier around just team dynamics. But when you know people, or people know you can deliver, she was talking about the project where, you get people who know you and know your abilities and are willing to give you more and more responsibility, because you can either deliver or you can kind of communicate it clearly what your expectations and problems are with what you're doing. I think that is a way, if you want kind of like I hesitate to call it like a blueprint for becoming a staff engineer, but I think I'm in my current role because one of my previous coworkers knows my abilities, knows my ability to lead projects, and needed somebody to effectively do what I'm doing right now. And he reached out to me and said, "Hey, this is at a different company now. Years after I really worked with him, and said, "Hey, are you interested in doing this?" And I think that's a way to do it. A lot, like, you'll find a lot of staff, and especially once you start talking principal or leadership roles, really don't get advertised very often. You're not going to go to most websites, at least, especially not at big end. I think big end companies tend to do more of this, but than smaller companies. But they're not going to post like job recs necessarily and just say, "Hey, we need somebody to do this. We need somebody to lead this project." They're going to, people in the networks or LinkedIn.
Ender, push to talk. Uh, Still can't hear you, Ender. If you want to finish that.
I think what he was going to say was that bigger companies don't really post jobs for higher level positions a lot of the time, because it ends up being a lot of referral where somebody at the company knows what work needs to be done, and they know someone in their network who would be a good fit for that project.
Yeah, my keyboard just decided to die on me at the best time ever. But yeah, like you get relationships with people, and I think that is a, when you're doing these more impactful projects, you start meeting more people, and people say, "Hey, Ender is good at leading cross team projects," and then in my case, like 2 years later, hey, we have this thing where We need somebody who's really good at SDLC processes to come in and make our SDLC processes not suck. Sweet, let's hire Ender. And, I think that approach often happens. Although I think we're way off the topic of that question now. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, this is gonna go even more off, but something I just wanted to add on to that as another tangent is if you're looking to, say, get senior, not quite as much, but if you're looking for like staff or senior staff, those are title promotions and role promotions where it is pretty hard to try to jump ship to another company and promote up to. Like almost, even in my case where I technically moved companies and got a technical title promotion, like it's mostly because my previous company had had a title band that was like very wide and didn't really have like a staff level role. It just had this giant role that counted as everything before senior staff. But I digress on that. Like the point I'm trying to make here is if you are looking to become a staff engineer from senior or progress beyond that, most of the time that experience and that promotion has to come from within the company you're at, and you're no longer just jumping every 2 years to try to get more comp or more promotion at that point, because you can't get the context right. Like at this level, your work is based on, say, like a 1 or 2 year time frame in the future. If you just jump every year or two, you can't even get settled in that timeline before you've already jumped off to somewhere else, and you'll never get that kind of scope, because like the kind of scope that you're talking about at this level is something that will span not just breadth across multiple teams, but also length across multiple, halves or multiple years. So most people who become like senior staff or principal or also on the management side become senior manager, become director. They're not just jumping back and forth for promotions. They're staying at a company, usually on the same team, for at least a couple years before they can make that next step, because you need that amount of time and you need that amount of scope to be able to make it to the next level.
Cool. Well, thanks for answering the question, everyone. Probably going to start wrapping up on questions. I have something I want to try at the end as well. For this question, have you ever worked at a bad company before, and how can you differentiate between a good engineering org and a bad one? And I guess also company as well as org. And what are the red flags?
I'm going to nominate Carl for this one.
I think I'm going to jump on this one, yeah. So I definitely talked a lot about my experiences with this in our last AMA. And actually, I previously posted a list of questions to ask your interviewer that is basically a list of scars that I've acquired from various companies that I didn't enjoy working at. I think the short list of it is, one of the biggest red flags is if you get through the interview, you get hired, you start working, the work that you're actually doing is dramatically different from what you were told you were going to be doing during the interview. I mean, one of my second to worst job, I was told I was going to be doing basically, JavaScript web development, and about 70% of my time was writing Java and data ingesters in Hadoop. So that was a big red flag for me even at the time. I just knew that, like, if you're told you're going to be doing one thing and you aren't doing that, like, what else are they going to lie to you about? One of the other experience that was the worst in my career was basically around constant outages. So one of the things that I started asking about in interviews is about like disaster recovery scenarios and like what is the on-call. Like what does on-call look like? What's the rotation? What's the process? How often do you need to use it? Things like that. Yeah, I have definitely worked for a number of companies that I did not like, but honestly, a lot of them were, I think they were pretty hard to suss out from the outside. It was only once I was on the inside that I really noticed how many rough edges they had. But yeah, I'll link that document that I wrote up in the event chat, because it really is basically like a point by point how I would have uncovered the bad jobs that I ended up working for.
Well, Ender, I think you were talking as well. Do you want to take the next one?
Yeah, I think like one of the things. So I will say I've never worked for what I would consider a bad engineering org, but I'm very, very much interviewing companies when I interview them. I think that's something that especially junior people don't realize is how much your interview of the company matters. You know, if a company screws up and hires someone wrong, like yeah, it sucks, and especially at small companies, it's it's going to be rough. But you know, if we're talking big end types of companies. You know, if they screw up 100 hires or 1,000 hires or even 10,000, well, okay, 10,000 would be a lot for most of those. But you know, like the impact on the company is much smaller than the impact is on you if you join a company where there's like a bad engineering org. And I think like you have to really figure out what bad is. There's certain things like, and I think Carl was talking about some of these where there's just like objectively bad things. You know, like if it's a really toxic culture, if it's sexist or racist or just in general like a really negative culture. But almost every company is going to have some sort of problem with the org or team that you're joining. That's why they're trying to hire you. And I think like recognizing what you actually enjoy doing and trying to understand what companies have that problem is like a good way to think about it, because no company is perfect. Every company is going to have its share of issues, and I think there are a couple. I believe in career questions here. There's a whole bunch of templates for different things to think of asking your employer. So I would highly recommend doing that, because I think part of why I felt like my experience where I've never really had a bad employer is that I spent a lot of time talking to either the hiring manager or prospective employees or prospective peers, stuff like that at the company, to try to understand what it's like. Like for example, I've reached out to people who know a hiring manager that I would be working for to understand, hey, what's is that a train wreck hiring manager or not? You know, if there's a high context thing, like there's companies do that for employees all the time, and I think people don't realize just how important that is. Um, so I don't know if you have anything else you want to add here too.
I think the only thing I really want to add on to this right here is I've also not. It's hard for me to really talk about this because I've been on one team at one company for about 98% of my career, up until like the last month or so, right? And it was more of actually, to answer this question, there were good times and bad times within the same team, and oftentimes even the same people and the same manager, where there were times where the morale was really bad, there were times the morale was really good, there were times where the morale was and the team culture was somewhere in between. And a lot of that actually had to do with not necessarily how the manager themselves, or the director, or et cetera, or the leadership was acting, but because there were certain constraints and other externalities, like this deadline thing that we were talking about with the release cycle that I was talking about before, that sort of forced everybody's hand to make not the best decisions, right? Like to make decisions that were, say, like crunch time, or having to focus on delivering feature after feature after feature, as opposed to working on fundamentals or craft commitments, right? And that all happened within the same team. And I will say that there was probably one person in that management chain during about a 2-year period where he was frankly just not very good of a leader. I think I disagreed with him an awful lot during those 2 or 3 years or so that he was there on our team for, where he just made some decisions where he focused a lot on specific metrics and specific feature development at a even greater cost than you would normally need to, just because your hand is forced by a deadline. And in the end, the way we sort of went out and fixed team culture was, it was me along with several of the other lead devs, as well as one or two of the managers. We kind of just basically were just like, this is not going to work. We either fix this now. It was kind of an ultimatum. We either fix this now and fix this culture, and you don't do that anymore, or this team is going to be dead and we're all going to be gone. We're all going to be gone, and you'll have nothing anyways, right? Like there is sort of a technicality there, which is like how many workplaces are where's the subtleties in, can you even have that kind of leverage, right? Are you allowed to band together and say that without, say, like getting PIP'd or getting fired or worse, etc.? I would like to think that at least in Big N, if you're somebody who has seniority, or somebody who's there, even if you're a junior engineer, I think most people have a lot more say in things than they actually think of, right? Because you're imagining that you're comparing to say like I'm working at McDonald's or I'm working a retail job, right? Most other jobs you don't have that kind of luxury. When you're a software engineer at like say like a big end company or even just any tech company where the engineers are very valuable, it's actually very costly for a company or bad manager to just force you out for no reason other than their ego or because they're trying to do a power play, right? Like hiring, I think Google's number that I remember from a couple of years ago was like I think hiring an engineer costs them like $100,000 to $200,000 just in upfront costs between the recruiters and all the other things that they have to do. It's expensive to hire, is expensive to fire. So you have a lot more clout, I would say, especially at the like the big end level, to be able to say no, this is not right. This is something that we need to work on, because you don't want to just let it sit there and rot, because everyone knows in the end that that's not how things will work out in the long term.
Cool. Awesome answer on that long one too. Did I miss someone for this question? Either Ender or Carl?
Nope, I think that's good.
I think we're good.
Cool. So we have a request. Someone raised their hand. Yagami. I'm going to invite you to speak if you have a question you want to ask these guys.
Hey, yeah, so I had a question, like, so I don't know how relevant it is to the panel, but just recently I've been in a sort of a confusion where I had to decide between two job offers. One was like both of them SD1 positions, but I had to choose between going to a lesser known startup, where is it like a private startup, and the one which is just going to IPO. The work is pretty much the same, but I don't know how much it affects like what company are you joining. Like if I want to switch to like a better company after 2 years, like does it really matter whether I join a private startup or a pre-IPO unicorn, so stuff like that. So that is my question. Yeah.
So Ender, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so just I think like in a general sense, thinking about job stuff is really like you figure out what you're optimizing for and make sure that you're optimizing for that. I think a lot of times people purely optimize for money, and I think especially on this Discord, that's partially because people are really earlier in their career. I think so. I was talking about this earlier that at a certain point, like money, it's not that money doesn't matter. It's that the quality of what you're doing at your job and the people you're working with and the type of work you're doing starts mattering a lot more. And I think that's something that I would definitely consider is what are you optimizing for? It's totally fine to optimize for money, by the way, but just make sure that if you're doing it for that purpose, you're very intentional about it. And then just try to really think through like the angle I generally like to try to think through things is obviously compensation is one factor, but like career development is another factor. Like, will this job advance my career? And advance my career doesn't necessarily mean get a promotion. It can also mean develop skill set in a certain thing you want to learn. Maybe you really want to learn React. So I'm not a front end person like Carl. So maybe if I really wanted to do front end types of work, I would think about that when it comes to evaluating a job. Now I don't want to do front end stuff. I like working in the SDLC kind of CI tooling space. So I'm happy to do that, not touch front end. But like,
Oh.
go ahead, Sam.
Oh no, I was saying, also to add on to that, right? I think another very important consideration that, this is also very personal, depends on your tastes and your personal preferences, but for example, for me, the work-life balance part is extremely important. So I, for example, would not take, a job at a place that required something like 60 hours a week, or even 50 hours a week, even for like a significant pay increase of like 30, 40, 50% or something like that. You'd have to pay me a lot more than just the extra hours that you're making me or that you're expecting me to work, because I want to focus on other things. I think when I was younger, I did chase TC and were worried about just maximizing numbers and etc. But even then, I got pretty. I don't even know if I necessarily that's true, even if I think I was really, really involved in wanting more money, because I never changed companies, right? I stayed at that same place for 7 years, even if there were other opportunities that may have been slightly more monetarily beneficial. I considered my team and the company I was working at to be relatively good work-life balance. Didn't really have to work more than the 40 hours a week, other than that, like that crunch period I talked about previously. And I don't think I would ever actively choose that kind of thing because there are just so many more important things other than just work in my life right now.
Yeah, that makes sense. Carl, do you have any thoughts on this?
I mean, I kind of missed some of the specifics of the question, but if it's like how to prioritize or how to choose a job, I definitely think figuring out what your personal priorities are is really the most important thing. And I think another aspect to it is trying to evaluate what information you're getting from each of the opportunities. And just to give it a personal example, when I took my current job, I ended up having to make a really difficult decision because I was working at a basically like a contracting house where they placed me. I worked for them. They placed me at a large company, and then they billed that company hourly for whatever rate. And when I told that company that I had gotten an offer I was seriously entertaining, they told me they wanted to put me on like a 2-year development track that ended in me being CTO. Ultimately, I went with the other offer mostly because like I didn't feel that I could trust an offer or I could trust commitment that relied on waiting 2 years. Which, maybe, who knows, maybe I was wrong. I did have a lot of confidence in one of the, execs at the company who was the COO. So maybe they were entirely in earnest. But, that was just a gut decision I had to make. And I think I made the right decision, but who knows, So I don't know. There's when you're evaluating different offers, it's just genuinely really hard, more or less every time. If you've got two compelling competing offers, you never really know if you made the right decision.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks for the input. So I have one more question. Sky unmuted though. Did you have anything to add?
Oh, I was just gonna say that it also is it's not as big of a deal at the more entry level, but once you get past like the first job or so, it becomes very hard to compare on a different level because different companies and different titles like are completely different. Like you could be a director of engineering at like a smaller medium-sized company with like 100 engineers, and your scope might not even be as big as like a random staff engineer at Google. Like there's just going to be like some weird technicalities there. Also, titles are completely different across the industry. There's some companies that'll just give out principal engineer to like people with like 5 years of experience because it's their first promotion up, and that's just what they call it. So that there's some research you have to do for jobs, especially later on in your career.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes sense. So I'm going to move on to the last question, and I want to kind of mention this beforehand. I can't ask everyone's questions. So if the speakers, it would be definitely appreciated if you went back through event questions and answered some of the questions afterwards. So this is a question that I'm pretty sure most people in this server wants, and I saved it till last for a reason. But have you ever had junior engineers ask too many questions, mostly related to volley questions, and how did you deal with that? And then where should junior engineers draw the line between active engagement, learning, and annoyance?
Yeah, this is
I'll
a
go ahead.
really-
Oh, I'll go ahead and start this one off then. I'll try to keep it short. I would say that the difference between a good question and a bad question, like of the you're wasting my time versus oh cool, right? It's not as much about how trivial the question is to me. It's about if I can get a sense or a feeling of how much time you put into trying to answer it yourself, right? Because the reason why I say that is because oftentimes there are questions that sound trivial to me because I have the experience for doing it, but of which are not even remotely easy to figure out by like Googling or even searching on like an internal company like message board or anything, because they're just not there just isn't that dearth of information on something specific, right? A very good example of this was when I remember I had a junior who was stuck on this like one compilation issue, this one compilation issue for like a whole day, and he didn't actually mention it until the next day. I think it was Tuesday morning. He came over to my desk and was like, I'm sorry to bug you, but I really need some help here. I walk over and it was like, I think I fixed it in like 30 seconds because it was just some random thing with the Gradle build file that I knew was specific to this particular project, because I had run into a very similar situation on a tangential project like 2 years ago, right? So that kind of knowledge you can't really search for, and there's no way that this person probably would have been able to figure it out without just asking somebody at random. And to me, it might seem trivial, but I don't consider that a waste of time. And I would have much rather this person ask something a bit sooner, because it's difficult. But then if you start asking something like, how do I make a build a Gradle build file? Like, these are things that you can probably Google in like 5 seconds, right? Those kinds of questions. It's not about how easy or difficult it is. It's how available is that knowledge to like a general public or to you without taking up someone else's time.
And definitely, what Sai opened with, if you put effort into trying to answer the question yourself, and it's a good question. The bad questions I see, and because I moderate a programming server where a lot of beginners ask for advice, a bad question to me is like, what's the best way to do this? What's the best? Basically, if the question starts with "what's the best," it's probably a bad question. You're stuck in a problem. If you're stuck in a compiler, or you're hitting some weird error that you're not expecting, then probably at least raise it. Generally, I think the best thing to do there is to in Slack, like, hey, I'm seeing this error. Here's the stack trace, or here's the error message. And I don't know. I think it's. I generally believe there are no bad questions except the ones that you don't try to answer for yourself. And I think I've never worked anywhere where there were people who would say you're asking too many questions. I generally associate that with. I hesitate to use the word lazy, but unsocial, not interested in mentorship, just wants to sit down and type on a keyboard for 8 hours of developer. I just think that as long as you have put effort into trying to answer the question for yourself, it's a good question to ask.
Yeah, that makes sense. Any thoughts?
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts on this because I was a moderator on a Stack Exchange site for I think 4 years, and so you deal with this on the other side where you're seeing the questions come in and you see how different they are. And I think so. I linked a blog. I guess it's a blog from John Skeet, who he's, I believe, the top person by rep on Stack Overflow, that he wrote about writing the perfect question. And I think really you want to make sure that you actually put the effort in and you actually try to do the troubleshooting. You can ask me, like I put in the message there, if you go through the effort to create a minimal example and try to really troubleshoot something, you can ask me almost as many technical questions as you want. And the reason I'm okay with that is because it's not going to take you very long if you put that sort of effort in before you start answering almost all your own questions and only ask me interesting, really hard questions. And I think people don't necessarily know how to answer, or sorry, how to ask questions. And I think it's because in a lot of cases we're used to just getting a quick answer. I might not know how to do something. In Carl's example, it's like, well, just go ping someone. Well, no, you don't necessarily want to ping someone. And I think just putting an actual lot of thought into how you ask questions is important. One of the things I think a lot of people don't do very well is there's this concept of an XY question. There's a site, and I'll link it after I'm done talking here. But the idea is you don't want to ask about your solution necessarily. You want to ask about what you're actually trying to do. So, for example, if you want to, oh gosh, I'm trying to think of a good example. The site has a bunch of them. But when you start talking about your solution, you end up derailing the ability for somebody to answer your actual question. And what that means is if you think you know how to do something and you do that, give it as context. Say, I'm trying to do X. Here's the problem I'm trying to solve is X, and what I'm thinking is Y. Is this the right approach? How do I what's the right solution here? And if you put a lot of energy and effort into expanding around what you're actually doing, you will first find you answer a lot of your own questions, because if you go through the effort to, like, for example, on Stack Overflow, there's a minimal complete verifiable example, I believe is what it is, MVCE. But in any event, like, if you have a bug or something that you're trying to do, distill down what your code is to the minimal code that will get you reproducing your question or your issue. And in my experience personally, if you actually do that, you find the issue a huge percentage of the time, because by the process of stripping out all of the unnecessary stuff, you find your answer. I mean, I think most folks here have been doing some sort of technical work for long enough. You realize, like, if you try to do the rubber duck approach and you try to explain it to yourself, you'll figure that out. And so I think, like, really understanding how to ask a good question is actually a lot more non-trivial than most people give it credit for. That resource there is one, and I think just really, like, putting the effort into it really does matter. And the second category of questions I think I want to make a different distinction on is that sometimes there's domain knowledge that you just don't know because you haven't had experience at a company. And I think to Sai's point earlier, like, knowing when you're blocked and when a quick question actually will save you a ton of time is really important. And I think that's a skill that takes effort and energy to grow. Most people are also relatively inexperienced at this, because you sort of have to have experience to know what you're not, what is I should ask Sai this question because, they've been at this company for so much longer than me, and I could go spend 4 hours researching some sort of domain knowledge, but I can just get this answer from them. And then once you get that, actually putting it somewhere so that the next person doesn't have to go through that same process. I think a lot of times I see more junior folks, especially, not realize, like, when they should be asking those sorts of questions, whether that's being blocked, whether that's, hey, what's this piece of domain knowledge? Kevin, you're at Amazon. One of the things there's just so much context for how things work that you can't just, like, go. You could go read every wiki there in some cases to do it, but sometimes a 5-minute conversation can save you hours. And it's not because you can't ask a good question; it's because you just straight up don't have that context. And I think, like, yes, I am passionate about asking questions, Kevin. When you're a mod,
You cut out again, Ender.
that's Discord's way of telling me to stop being passionate about this, I think. But when you're a moderator on a Stack Exchange site, and like, one of the things that I would do there is edit people's questions. And so I was a moderator on the workplace, which is kind of, like, interestingly, a lot of context around this. How do I do X? How do I do Y? Types of things in the workplace environment. People really struggle to identify their core problem, and I think that's one of the things I feel like I'm pretty good at from all of that experience. I'm going to stop just going on about this, or I'm going to talk about how awesome you should ask questions for the next 20 minutes.
Yeah, so kind of add on that, something I've heard, and I kind of want your thoughts, is that someone had a rule where you spent 10 to 20 minutes trying to figure out the question yourself, and if you couldn't do it in that time, you would ask someone else. Because beyond that time is wasting engineering hours that you could spend building if someone else had that answer. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've actually struggled with in some ways moving to a staff role is recognizing that in a lot of cases, it's pretty hard to accept that you're going to be able to solve someone's question or do something for someone in maybe 10% of the time, or in some cases just even a fraction of the time due to your context and experience. I don't know that I would say a specific number. I think you should be conscious of that and put the effort in. I think if you're trying to do something and you're completely blocked, trying to even think through, okay, why am I blocked on this? Why am I not understanding? And really, like, thinking through it. I don't know, so if you've thought about the specific number, I really don't think about the specific time. I think it's much more how much energy do you put into something.
Yeah, I don't think there's, like, a specific number or anything. The way I sort of think of it is there's, like, 2 categories of people, right? There's the people who have asked questions and then, something that they didn't know they spent 4 hours on or some amount of time on, and then they asked the question, and then even if it was trivial for someone to answer, right? Like, I'm like, oh, it's just this, right? Blah, 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 blah. 30 seconds later, everyone's happy, we have the answer. The real hallmark of sort of, then this takes some time to sort of recognize in people as the months go on, and you work with people as coworkers and etc. But the difference is going to be person A doesn't ask me that question again. Person B keeps asking that question over and over again and never learns from what they're asking, right? And I think that in itself is the more key difference between what being a good engineer and a bad engineer is if you're just relying on someone else constantly and you never learn from these experiences that are completely teachable moments, right, to make yourself better, you're not going to be a good engineer, and more than likely people are not dumb, right? Like people are going to realize this after you're able to get away for it with for like 3 or 6 months or something at the beginning, but you're going to very quickly find yourself as not the most loved person on the team. You're probably gonna get bad reviews, etc. Because no one wants somebody who just relying on other people constantly to do their job, right? But relying on someone to be able to do something once is not necessarily a bad idea, but having to rely on somebody to do something multiple times, especially if it's the same thing, is generally a bad idea.
Yeah, that drives me nuts when people do that. That's hard for me not to be frustrated with people about.
Yeah, I agree with that. I should probably stop that here because I feel like junior questions and just questions in general could become its own topic, really. And if you want to host your own AMA in your presentation on asking questions, I would love to have it. So I wanted to thank everyone for the questions so far, and again, remind you, feel free to check out the event questions that weren't answered and ping those people. I do want to open up the floor to both of you guys. Carl had to go, but I wanted to give you about 5-ish minutes each to just share your general advice and knowledge and any resources you have and any other thing you want to communicate with people. So, Sky, you want to go first?
I don't know how much I have as like closing thoughts, but I think the one that I sort of mentioned before, I just want to reemphasize here about this is not a ladder where like the actual engineering ladder is really short, right? Like you're pretty much most people in their careers climb up the one or two ranks from junior to mid-level to senior, and then they just sit there happily for the rest of their career at like mid-level or senior, and that does not remotely in any sense of the word make you a failure. They're a lot of the most successful people I've ever seen just stay there at that level because that's just what the it's you don't not everyone wants to be a manager, not everyone wants to manage people, and that's not something to be ashamed of, and not something to be to feel like, oh, I'm not just keeping on climbing the ladder and being a better person or something. It doesn't really work like that because the skills and what you're doing change a lot when you move into either management or into like an official SWE management role or a software engineering management role or like a more leadership management software engineering IC track like a staff or principal engineer. There just there's no shame and it is completely acceptable. In fact, I think the numbers are generally that about 85 to 90% of most companies, I'm using Big N here as a number here, are going to be senior or below. So in like those first 3 ranks or so of junior, mid-level, senior, you're going to have like 85-90% of the people all be in those levels, and it is not something that is expected whatsoever to keep going up above that. And it doesn't mean that you I see a lot of people who get like this mentality of like, oh, if I'm not getting promoted every 2 years, I'm not doing well or something. And I think that's kind of ridiculous. There's like this whole ethos around places like CS Career Questions or Blind, where people get really blindsided by this idea that they need to to be successful, they need to keep climbing and climbing and climbing as fast as they can. And it really just isn't that true. Like you're a very good engineer if you can just be a good solid mid-level or senior engineer. If you can make it to say like a big company, you're going to make a lot of money. there's a lot more things that are important than just chasing after titles and titles and titles here.
Yeah, honestly, that was what I was going to say too. And I think, especially given the audience here, where this Discord tends to be more early career folks, I graduated undergrad in 2010, and you all make me feel like practically ancient in some cases. And I'm still early in my career, really. But I think like one of the things to really think through is what do you actually want to do? What do you want your day-to-day to look like? So I was briefly a manager in one of my previous companies, and I realized like what fulfills me is I need a mix of that deep work, like I'm digging into technical problems. Like I need that because I really find that valuable. And so I have no interest in pursuing management. Even though I know that it's absolutely like you hit a point in the technical track in most companies where there's just not as many like more senior leadership type of roles, and I'm okay with that. It's totally fine with that. One of my previous bosses went from just like a first level manager. He's now a VP at my company now, and like it doesn't appeal to me. And I think like one of the things that a lot of people just really don't think through, and this gets to the advice that I was giving the person who was asking kind of the job thing, is just what are you actually optimizing for? What do you want to do? And I think for me, the way I think about that is what type of work do I actually want to do on a day-to-day basis? Not so much the position or the title. I think, so you were talking about this earlier, that different companies have very different, like expectations around the different titles and this. You can't even necessarily look just at the title, but just what do you get passionate about doing? And generally we gravitate towards things we're good at. Like part of the reason I like being in a staff level role is because I like assimilating information and taking lots of information together and trying to contextualize it and make decisions that are you need all that information for. I like that. I get excited about that. I get really interested in that. I'm the guy who reads all of the Slack channels, that he's lurking in and just assimilates the context. I can read pretty quickly and it's great. That's just what I like doing. It's what I've been doing for years of my career. And so for me, it makes sense to be in this sort of role because it's the type of things that I just do on a daily basis and I like doing. But I know a lot of people who just see it in to Sai's point earlier, just it's not the next thing necessarily unless it's actually the right thing for you. And that applies to a lot of really, I mean, even way more than just this. It's just kind of a life type of thing, really. When you think about it, it's just you got to figure out what you want to do and the types of things you want to do with your life, and then optimize for those. Don't optimize for, the levels.fyi career track or whatever you want to optimize for.
Yeah, and adding on to what Ender said in terms of optimizing for what you like to do, right? Like, I don't consider myself as some brilliant coder who can just write code circles around other people. Like, I don't know how many of you have seen me in the, say, like binary search rooms that we sometimes do here in this Discord, where we just solve like LeetCode problems together. I'll usually solve all of them. I'll usually be able to do all of them. So like I'm competent. I'm fairly fast. I'm probably above average, but like there's people, including juniors, people who are even still in college who literally code circles around me. And that's totally fine. It's just that's not necessarily my strongest point. My strongest point by far is that I have a pretty good knack of just pulling together very unrelated looking things and being able to connect the dots, being able to, sort of synthesize a lot of far-reaching information into one, coalesced solution or idea, be able to come up with ideas that might be able to connect different pieces together that other people weren't necessarily thinking about. Those kinds of scope, that kind of scope where you're thinking about the bigger and bigger picture is something that I am very good at, and that tends to be why I I both like and succeed in the role that I'm in.
Yeah, and if you just want to code every day and you want to like make really freaking cool stuff, like just do that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And I know a lot of folks on this Discord just absolutely love that. And you can make it feels like crazy amount of money just doing that. At Big N, you can get up to, like crazy numbers just being, in a lot of ways, a mostly coding machine. You're not going to get like, the crazy, principal engineer at, fill in the blank Big N. But like, does that matter? I don't know. I think a lot of people don't do enough introspection on what they're actually optimizing for.
Cool. Thanks for the input, you guys. And I kind of mentioned earlier, this includes Carl as well. Thanks for all three of you for joining this AMA and providing wonderful experience and answers to everyone's questions. Sure, everyone enjoyed it. So I'm going to wrap up kind of the AMA part. Just kind of go to a conclusion. We have these events. We're going to keep having more. We have one on the schedule right now with a tentative date of July 22nd, but that's no official date yet, so that could change. It's engineering leadership roundtable, more senior than the senior engineers you see today. It's going to be a director, a VP, and other people at that level. So start getting your questions for that. We will send out two forms after this. One will be to get your feedback on the event, and another one is that we're looking for moderators and server contributors to kind of help build CSCH even more for the server side. Both of those will be sent out shortly. We record all these in video, so they'll be uploaded to both YouTube and our website. They'll have timestamps for each of the questions, and you should be able to go there and see a recap of everything that we talked about today. Hopefully, the unanswered questions will be able to get some answers as well, not just by the speakers, but everyone else who wants to contribute later on. We want to keep going with these, so we need event ideas as well as speakers. So if you're interested, reach out to Brenda and FF and any other server contributor with your interest in what the topic will be. So yeah, thanks for everyone joining today. That's a speaker and all the people who joined to listen in. Hopefully you got all your questions answered, and look forward to doing this later on.